Hello and welcome to Buy the Book. I'm your host, Joe Hebert. Today we continue our discussion of Machiavelli's legacy. This is part of our course on truth, justice, and leadership. And this will be the last uh, episode that is focused on Machiavelli per se. We are not looking at his entire comprehensive legacy, but last time we talked about his influence on political thought, including social contract theory, but with a particular focus on how both Hobbes and Locke, and then later Adam Smith, as part of their theory of society and politics, are heavily focusing political life and therefore life in general on economic issues and on the accumulation of wealth, and how this could be understood as being founded in Machiavelli's teaching in The Prince. In fact, in the case of Locke, I think he's making a very clear allusion to Machiavelli with that. So today we would like to continue that discussion of capitalism and also talk about socialism, how the two of them relate in terms of modern life and modern politics, and how this all relates back to the influence that Machiavelli has had over us. From there, we're going to move on to look at some other schools of thought, and we will continue to come back and compare and contrast them to Machiavellian ideas throughout this course. So, just to continue the reflections on capitalism, you may have been wondering in the last episode, is capitalism definitively a Machiavellian thing? If one appreciates or supports capitalism to any extent, is that necessarily Machiavellian? The answer to that, I would say, is complex. Part of it would depend on exactly how we define capitalism, and part of it also would be the context in which we place it and the particular motives we have for promoting it, and also the framework within which we promote things. So, very briefly, I would like to look at a way that we could discuss capitalism or aspects of capitalism from a Socratic framework. We haven't looked at Socratic thought in depth as of yet, but just to give a little contrast to the way that we might look at this from a classical point of view versus the way that Machiavelli has influenced these ideas. So if we take a look at Sir Thomas More, he's a figure who is concurrent with Machiavelli. There is no direct evidence of his being aware of Machiavelli or vice versa, although it's a broad possibility. But Thomas More is both as a thinker, a writer, as well as a statesman, and he was actively engaged in English politics throughout his life. He is bringing a very explicitly Socratic and classical perspective on politics, philosophy, ethics, and these things. So, how does he address these questions about property in a way that we could compare and contrast to Machiavelli, Hobbes, Locke, and Adam Smith? Well, in one of his writings, Dialogue of Comfort Against Tribulation, which was written just towards the end of his life, actually, when he was in prison and soon to be executed for high treason for not supporting King Henry VIII. And by the way, as I've mentioned before, Henry VIII's maneuvers were classic Machiavellian maneuvers. Whether or not he was directly looking at Machiavelli, which is quite possible, he was certainly implementing the key concepts that we saw in The Prince. And Thomas More died rather than to support the king in those policies. So it's about as direct a confrontation with Machiavellianism as you could get. But around this time, More is writing, and in this dialogue, a question comes up, and it has to do with property. And the question is basically that if we're following the gospel, we saw before how St. Paul talks about, for example, that the love of money is the root of all evils, that we have to be content with just what we need and not be chasing after riches, otherwise it will lead us astray. And so a character in this dialogue is thinking, he's wealthy and he's a Christian, and he's thinking, do I simply have to give my money away? Do I have to give up this wealth because it's incompatible with the gospel? And the answer that's given in this dialogue from the older, wiser figure who seems to represent Thomas More himself is that is a twofold answer. First of all, it is absolutely true that the gospel teaches poverty as a virtue, and that would mean actual poverty or at least spiritual poverty, that is detachment from worldly goods. So being attached to worldly goods is spiritually deadly. The character emphasizes that he would not recommend for anybody to cling to their wealth or to pursue wealth for its own sake, as it would be spiritually disastrous. On the other hand, Anthony, that's the character here, he argues that it is not necessary for Christians to give up wealth, that wealth, in fact, serves a useful purpose within society, and if it's used properly, then it's a good thing. And so part of the argument we see here, the argument you could say against communism or socialism that More makes through Anthony. And one thing he points out is if you took all the money in the world and you put it in a big pile and then evenly distributed it, it would not solve the problem of poverty that exists in the world, because everybody would be equally poor at that point. One reason would be simply the mathematics. How much money would that be? And if you do the math, he's suggesting that each person would not have enough to be wealthy. But the reality is more complicated than that, because the value of money is not a fixed thing, right? It's a relative thing. Without getting into economic theory too much, the purchasing power of money is all relative to the market and to the supply and demand in the market. And so More through Anthony goes into a little bit more depth on this. Not only would the amount of money be minuscule, but more significantly, it would disrupt the market relationships that exist in real life. Nobody would be an owner of anything anymore. Nobody would own the means of production. He goes on to reflect how nobody could survive in this society unless there was some kind of division of labor and property. So some people are, the property owners. They can hire other people. They own the means of production. They own the ships that the sailors can sail. They own, the factories and things that people can work in. So those relationships would be disrupted by any such strategy. And therefore, the people who are rich currently would suffer, but also people who are poor right now would suffer, because they would have fewer opportunities to try to make money. There would be chaos and confusion. Nobody would know how to produce anything or do anything. So we could go deeper into this, but the point is that there is an aspect of markets and property and exchanges which is well understood in classical thought as being part of the common good. But it goes along with a warning, a very severe warning, that we are easily tempted and led astray by greed. And the emphasis is on practicing virtues such of self-restraint, basically, such as moderation and generosity and things of that nature. And if we had time, we could get into stories about Thomas More and how he himself set a very profound example in that light. But I'd like to move on and get back to the Machiavellian strain that we're considering here, and go back for a minute to John Locke and to Adam Smith before moving on to socialism. So previously we saw with Locke how he is building on a Machiavellian foundation by arguing that nature, which is sort of like fortune in Machiavelli, things outside of our control, nature gives us basically poverty. It gives us a kick in the pants. It gives us a need to produce and to rescue ourselves from poverty. The means by which we do that are basically two. On the one hand, there's labor. So Locke goes into great detail in his chapter on property about how the value of things is determined by the amount of labor in them. Nature itself is practically worthless in his account, and the value of anything to us is in proportion to how much we labor and transform it. The other thing is that no amount of labor would be adequate to accumulate any great amount of wealth or value if the things that we were making or preparing for use were spoiling we couldn't, hoard a lot of stuff if it was all spoiling or if it wasn't of any particular use to us. So the invention of money, which is an artificial construct, a social construct, is absolutely crucial because with the invention of money, as long as I produce anything of value and I can sell it, I can find somebody who needs it and sell it, I can accumulate a potentially endless amount of money. That money will not spoil. And this is the key for Locke's argument. I am not impoverishing society by doing that. I'm enriching society because the things that I'm selling to make that money do not exist by nature. They only exist by my labor. So the more that I labor and sell things, and I'm accumulating this money, but the money is coming from a value that I basically created that was not there before I did that. So, in other words, if we didn't have people enriching themselves by piling up all this money, we would be living in a poor world where there would be no major production going on, and we'd be living with nature, which is pretty much worthless. And he gives many, many examples of that in chapter 5 of the second treatise. This paragraph that I'm putting up here is one of the places where he acknowledges that the result of his theory, that is setting us free to focus on production by giving us property and the right to property, and therefore the motivation to transform the world, to conquer fortune, as Machiavelli would put it, by transforming nature as much as we possibly can. We're motivated to do that by a limitless accumulation of wealth. So this, as he knows, is a contradiction of Socratic thought and Christian theology that tell us that the endless accumulation of wealth is not a safe, spiritually safe thing. And he's saying it's enriching the world, enriching society, and it should be considered a purely good thing as long as you're doing it through productivity. But he admits that it's going to lead to an unequal distribution of wealth because not everybody will be equal, either in their capacity, their ability to transform nature, or their shrewdness at figuring out what do people need and who needs it and how can I get it to them, and maximizing profits, all the different things that go into that. Not everybody's going to be equal there, right? And his defense of that, again, is that you're enriching society as a whole. So as he argues, the poorest person in a rich nation is richer than the richest person in a poor nation. So even though there's an inequality of wealth, everybody is benefiting from it because even a little tiny bit of a great amount of wealth is better than a large percentage of a tiny amount of wealth. And so this is, I would say, is sort of the foundational battle cry for what we now call capitalism, which is, promoting the potentially limitless accumulation of wealth and economic power, the ability to create things of value, means of production, and so forth, and seeing that as basically a benefit to society. So greed is good. Basically, the more you're trying to accumulate, as long as you're doing it by honest means, then you are a great benefactor to society. So you take the richest people on the planet. So how did they get rich? They got rich by figuring out what people need and giving us products that we all need and we use, and that's why they're so rich. So we shouldn't envy them or resent that because we're all benefiting from what they did, although they're certainly benefiting more in a material sense than we are. But that's the way it goes. They're the ones who came up with the idea and sold it and made it happen. So for the next little piece of this, I want to go back to Adam Smith for a minute because in his Wealth of Nations, he obviously has a lot to say. He's developing this Lockean concept into a very meticulous science that's come to be known as the science of economics. It was still moral philosophy when Smith was writing. But in any case, one of the really significant arguments that Smith emphasizes, which has become an obvious feature of modern capitalistic society, is what we might call the economies of scale, mass production. Why is that so important? It's important for many reasons, but the core reason is efficiency. So he gives the example of pin making, and he says that in traditional methods of making pins, first of all, nobody would be a specialist at making pins in traditional society. You would have a blacksmith who would make a wide variety of products, including pins, for example. Nobody would really be specialized in that. There'd be no particular reason for it. But also, even if somebody just decided to focus on making pins, they would not be able to make very many per day. Maybe one a day, he says, but certainly not more than 20 a day. Uh, on the other hand, he talks about a pin factory that he visited. And of course, the pin factory was a large scale operation. So you had, in this case, you had 10 people and they were focused on making pins. But this is another important part. Each one of them wasn't making, pins independently. They broke down the pin making process into 10 steps, and each person was doing one step. So famously, he talks about the last step. The last person on the assembly line is just putting the heads on pins. And that's all this person does all day long, is just put heads on pins. Well, why is that important? First of all, economically, it's important because he says those 10 persons can make thousands of pins. And in fact, if you divide it up per person, he thinks that you've got about 4,000 pins per person coming out of that factory. So just think of the difference between, let's say, 20 pins a day versus 4,000 pins a day. Laws of supply and demand are such that the price of pins is going to plummet, right? The pins are now abundant. Pins used to be relatively rare. It was hard to make them. They're going to be more expensive. Now pins are extremely easy to make. They're going to be extremely cheap. Nonetheless, you can make a profit from making pins, mass manufacturing pins, if you know what you're doing, because you can flood the market with these things. You can find out who needs pins. You can even change people's lifestyles, so you're going to use more pins than they ever did because they're so cheap now. So the point is that the economies of scale, if you know what you're doing as a business owner, you can scale these things up and you can make products that are cheaper. More people are going to buy them, and you're going to sell lots of them and make huge profits. But what is the flip side of that? As Smith well knows, this is going to change how everybody lives in many different ways. We don't have time to go through all of it, but just imagine the difference between the factory owner, in this case, who is making tremendous profits from this pin making business, and is not in the assembly line, and is able to do other stuff all day, while some people are kind of stuck on that assembly line just putting heads on pins all day long. And that's what they do. And they get a relatively small part of the profits of that. They get, whatever the owner can afford to pay them, basically, where they just wouldn't walk away. So you could still argue that this is in the common good for everybody, but Smith, even as he's promoting this as generally very good for the common good of society, or it's going to be enriching, as we said before, like with Locke, the poorest person in this society is going to have more stuff than the richest person in a poor society. But it's also creating, those relationships that Thomas More talked about how some people are employing others and everything. These things are getting more stark. The differences are getting more stark. And it creates a potential for abuse. For example, the working conditions in that factory. Those machines that are used increasingly to do this kind of stuff could be dangerous. The conditions could be otherwise unhealthy. And the operations could be, drudgery and really just, psychologically or physically harmful in the long term to people doing it. And all of these things, there's minimal motivation for the owners to really be concerned about this, because it's all necessary for the profitability of this enterprise to make it as efficient as possible. And those things would often seem inefficient to try to address those. They might be part of the efficiency, basically. So some of the side effects of this for human society, people having to move to find work instead of having a lot of little workshops everywhere. You only have a few factories here and there that are mass producing things. So just so many things in society will be disrupted in so many different ways. how is that all going to work? And Smith is well aware it's not all going to be good. There's going to be new kinds of problems in this kind of society that will have to be dealt with. He still thinks overall it's a big plus and it has to be done. But of course, it's going to become controversial. And this is exactly where socialism comes into the modern world. So, everybody is familiar with Karl Marx. And Marx, of course, is sort of the quintessential spokesperson for a critique of capitalism and for communism and socialism as a response to that. We're not going to go into great depth about Marx here. I want to look a little bit more in this course at Woodrow Wilson for a variety of reasons that we'll see in a minute. But we'll want to take a brief look here at some of the core aspects of Marx's response. For example, because Marx is a critic of capitalism and because some of the issues with capitalism could be described as moral issues, and because, as I noted, within classical thought, there's aspects of capitalism that could be appreciated, but other aspects of it that would be criticized. Put it all together, and the Marxist critique could sometimes be misunderstood in terms of other sorts of critiques of capitalism. And one thing that's really important to see about Marx, he considered himself a scientific, communist or socialist, that he had a scientific theory that history is progressing towards a communist utopia, basically. And the scientific aspect of it is significant because Marx does not look at capitalism as simply a bad thing. As a matter of fact, he looks at it as a necessary stage in the evolution of history. And why is that? Because I would say, in a nutshell, he accepts the Machiavellian premises that you can see in that version of capitalism that we've been talking about. He accepts the idea that human nature is basically at war with nature itself, that the purpose of human history is to conquer fortune or conquer nature, that a necessary stage of this is capitalism because capitalism produces the means of production that enable us to tame nature, to master and conquer nature to the point where we can extract everything from it that we need to live a comfortable and decent life. Marx is a materialist, so he literally says there's no higher meaning or purpose to life other than material well-being. He still uses a lot of terminology that sounds a little bit moral. As we've seen, this is actually quite typical for the Machiavellians because they do have to mythologize their thought to some extent. They have to make it attractive. They have to give it a sense of purpose and meaning. But when you dig into the technicalities of their thought, often like with Hobbes, just come out and telling us there's no meaning to life. This is just, this is going to be the least painful way we can live. That's why we're doing it, not because it has any actual meaning to it. So this is also quite characteristic of Marx. But in a nutshell, what is he, suggesting? First of all, he's looking at what he calls the contradictions of capitalism, that it's succeeding at conquering nature, but what it's not succeeding at is really satisfying the desires of humanity, because the way that it conquers nature is that it gives so much to the capitalist. This is where the term capitalism becomes really important. Capital refers to the means of production, the things that make it possible. So owning a factory, you would have to own, the physical plant. You would have to own the machines that may be necessary. Whatever the technologies, the techniques, the information, that may be necessary for how this is done, the formulas, chemical formulas, and this and that. Everything that without which you couldn't do the production, or you couldn't do it efficiently, you couldn't do it profitably. All those things are, for that reason, extremely valuable, because if you have them, you can run this enterprise and make money. But if you don't have them, you can't do it. So who can have access to that? Marx's theory is that it's going to remain a very small number of people, and it's going to be a circular thing. Those who own the means of production will be getting the vast majority of the profits. Therefore, they will continue to own the means of production. and those who don't will be working for pennies, basically, because that's all they're going to be. That's all that's going to be available in that system. So it's therefore driving a wedge between the owners, the capitalists, and the proletariat, those who subsist by selling their labor. And he thinks this is just going to get worse and worse over time because the dynamics of the system make it worse. So it's a failure in this sense. It's not making people happy. If you go back to Machiavelli's Prince, the fatherland is happy. It's not making the people content because there's all this wealth that they're generating, but most of them don't get a big enough share of it to be satisfied with that. And so for Marx, the solution is built in to this, which is that it's going to make the people so dissatisfied and angry that they revolt. And he says the proletariat will use its political supremacy after the revolution to wrest by degrees all capital from the bourgeoisie, those who own the means of production, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, that is, of the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. So you notice that what he's doing is he's moving from one Machiavellian framework to another, saying the original capitalist Machiavellian framework, you have this incentive of profit seeking, trying to accumulate property under the protection of the prince or the government. But there's an unequal distribution of that wealth and a discontent that comes from that. So therefore, the people have to seize control of the government or the state and use that to centralize ownership. And this is where socialism comes in. So the government actually owning or controlling the means of production on behalf of the people. So it's the same basic formula as Machiavelli's Prince, where the prince is protecting the people and is allowing them to enjoy property. But it's a question of who's going to be in control of that and how's that going to work. And this is, in a sense, giving even more power to the prince than in a capitalist system where the prince just kind of watches over, this accumulation of wealth. Whereas in a socialist system, the prince is actually in control of that to make sure that it's going to be equally or fairly distributed and shared among the people. So that, in a nutshell, is you can see that capitalism and socialism can be seen as two competing types of Machiavellianism, and they're each appealing to the basic goal of the Machiavellian paradigm, which is that the prince enables the people to be satisfied with the accumulation and enjoyment of material things, but there's a disagreement about how that is best going to be accomplished. And I'll just note that each of these could be looked at from a Machiavellian lens as having some strengths or weaknesses versus the other one. So as I mentioned, Marx could argue that the capitalist model is weak because even though it's promising people the satisfaction of material things, it's giving so much more to some than others that the majority aren't really going to be satisfied with that. But on the other hand, I think one of the many problems that you get into with socialism is that once you centralize control over these things, and you give that somehow to the people, well, there's many problems with that. First of all, the people as a whole, as Machiavelli points out, they don't want power. So somebody has to represent them. So these socialist systems always claim to represent the people, but it's actually just a different set of elites who claim to represent the people. It's never the people themselves actually doing it. And that seems to be an insoluble problem. But also, when it's the capitalists who are doing this and they're driven by profits, they have a motive to actually do it and figure out all the million things that have to be figured out. How do you make a profit making pins? I'm not a businessman myself, but I'm just guessing that, in fact, statistically, vast majority of businesses fail, right? So it's easy to fail at these things. Who's going to figure out how to succeed with something? If you don't have the profit motive anymore, and there's just some centralized bureaucracy in charge of this, without the motive, is it even going to work at all? And what you actually find in socialists, to the extent that socialism prevails, you tend to find a loss of wealth, even to the point of mass starvation and other horrific things in some cases. So really, between the two of them, I would have to say that the capitalist system is a more successful form of Machiavellism than socialism. But on the other hand, it's very non-random that socialism comes in over and over again as a competing model, because there is this reality of the vast inequalities that are not just an accidental result of that capitalist model, but are really kind of baked into it, that the profit motive is going to be driving this. And as was admitted all the way back to Locke, that we're going to have to accept those inequalities. But is that really going to be easy to do for the people? And is it going to be easy to keep them satisfied with that over time? So the final person I'd like to look at here in this episode is Woodrow Wilson. Wilson is a very significant figure in American history in two different ways. One is a theorist, and he was a constitutional scholar who published a lot of stuff. We're going to look at some of his professorial writings here just to get his theory of things. But of course, later he was United States president and was very influential in starting to reshape the U.S. government. And he was part of a movement that's called the Progressive Movement, which started in the late 1800s and went through a few waves and probably hit its point of greatest strength in the 1930s with Franklin Roosevelt. But to this day, of course, is a continuing force in American politics, newer versions of it. And we don't have time to get into the great nuance on progressivism, but suffice to say that even today, to describe somebody as a socialist could be considered controversial or insulting, although we do have politicians who successfully get elected while describing themselves as socialists. And this goes back, to the beginning of the progressive movement. So as we'll see, Wilson was not afraid to identify himself as a socialist, even though when he ran for president later, he did not emphasize that. But in his intellectual writings, he was quite willing to accept that label. And so we're going to see, the particular way that this came into American government and politics through the example of Wilson. Now, one of the essays that Wilson wrote in 1890 was called Leaders of Men. So in this course on leadership, this is, I think, a particularly apt way for us to look at these issues and how they came to play in American society. We can see from this quotation, for example, that Wilson is, there's nothing romantic about his conception of leadership. Leadership is about control. And he makes it clear in this paragraph that it's not about character. That is, it's not about morality in a classical sense. The purpose of a leader is not to help to improve, people's character or bring about a happier life through, ethical improvement of society, basically. Rather, it's a matter of an application of force, as he puts it here. And he's talking about movements, mass movements, basically. Things have to get done. Things have to happen. We've got to move people in certain directions. And people are basically the materials upon which the leader is operating. A very, you could say, a very demeaning kind of way of looking at the people that the leader is leading. They're just raw materials for him to, shape in a certain way. And he's not interested in them as individuals or individually trying to help them become better people or anything of that nature, which, as we'll see, is what classical leadership in politics is focused on, is trying to help people become better and achieve happiness through virtue. So that looks, sounds very condescending towards, the people. But in this paragraph, he flips it around and says, well, the older view of legislation or of government was that, the people who were legislating were supposed to be, above the people in a certain sense. That is, they're trying to look at some kind of higher good and they're trying to bring people into that somehow. But here he says the sovereignty of the people is a modern dogma of politics. So in modern times, and he emphasizes, in the 19th, we're in the 19th century now, so things are different. This is a very classic progressive kind of argument. And this self-referential rhetoric towards this is the modern era, so we do things in a different way. I think it has Machiavellian roots, right? Because Machiavelli's whole point is we need a new paradigm. And in this new paradigm, the government is founded on the people. So the government is there to satisfy the people's desires, to help the people to get what they want. And so Wilson says whether or not people have accepted this in theory, and he implies some people are still fighting against this, they won't go along with it. But in practice, this has been decided. This is the way things are now. It's indisputable. And so he says public opinion must be truckled to, if you will use a disagreeable word. And this is something Wilson loves to do. He takes these classical attitudes, whether it's a classical virtue or in this case, a classical vice. Truckling to is basically talking about flattering the people, giving them stuff that's not really good for them, like giving tons of candy to kids to make them like you. And he said, you can call it that if you want, but that's what it's really all about, is giving the people what they want. And this next paragraph, is I think highly significant because he says, what this means is that you're going to have to get over your own philosophical notions of what is true and what is good, and you're going to have to deal with what the people think and believe and desire. So, for example, if you think that 1 and 1 make 2, but the people think that 1 and 1 makes something else other than 2, then you're going to have to legislate on the supposition that 1 and 1 do not make 2; they make something else. As the people say. So this is a clear sign that Wilson is operating in terms of the effectual truth, not the theoretical truth. Like Machiavelli, he thinks it's a matter of power and force. Like Machiavelli, he thinks it's a matter of satisfying the people. Like Machiavelli, he thinks it's not about the truth, it's about the effectual truth. It's about getting things done, keeping people satisfied. Now here, Wilson addresses a classical criticism of this, kind of politics of satisfying desires, and that is that the term demagogue refers to a ruler who pleases the people, but why? Because he wants power. So he just uses that as a way of becoming popular and getting power. And this is, of course, a pejorative term, and it's pretty much the opposite of statesmanship. A statesman in classical sense is somebody who aims at the truth and justice and the common good and does whatever is necessary to try to get people to move in that direction, even if they don't want to. Tries to persuade them, tries to induce them to do what's actually good. And so Wilson is blowing apart this distinction. He says, yeah, you can go and criticize demagogues if you want. He calls it like a hobby. Some people love to just criticize demagogues. Go ahead, fine. But he says an actual statesman is actually doing the same thing as a demagogue, but there's only one difference. The demagogue is doing it for short-term benefits, so giving the people what they want now for the sake of getting some power now. Whereas the statesman is somebody who's doing this in a big picture. He's looking ahead and saying, what are the people going to be wanting in the next 10, 20, like however far you want to go. He doesn't give an exact time frame, but he's looking ahead and seeing what are the longer term desires of the people and how are those going to be satisfied. So think back to Machiavelli. Machiavelli is talking about a kind of prince who doesn't just get power for even just one lifetime, but it's going to be glorified after he's dead. So it's all based on satisfying desires, but projecting way out multiple generations, not just the immediate desires of the moment. So unlike classical thought, which tries to transcend desire towards objective good, Machiavellian statesmanship still goes beyond petty, tyranny, but it's not going after something that's higher in nature. It's just going after something that is longer term and bigger picture. So now we get into a slightly earlier essay that he wrote on socialism, because, well, what are these long-term interests, and what exactly does he think a statesman should be aiming at? And in this essay, he basically says that democracy and socialism are essentially the same thing, and that he's defining socialism as the idea, as he puts it here, that society has to be organized to achieve all the results that people desire in terms of material goods. So everybody has, a job where they can make sufficient money, and they can live, a good life in the material sense. State socialism in particular is saying that the state or the government has to ensure that these things happen. Now, how is that possible? As we saw before, generally it's either state ownership or state control. And Wilson, obviously operating in American context, is not trying to go towards direct state ownership of everything, but rather progressives are mainly going to focus on regulation, government regulation, and things like that to control things. But the crucial point that he makes here in this paragraph is that we have to get over the distinction between private and public affairs. There is no boundary between private and public that the state cannot cross if it's going to succeed at having sufficient control to ensure the results that are deemed to be fair or good. So that he does, this. Remember, this is an era where totalitarianism is starting to become a practical reality in the world. And Wilson is saying that the legislator, the state, is omnipotent. It has to be able to control everything, private or public, in order to produce the desired results. And you can call this socialism or you can call it democracy. For him, there's no essential difference, because that's what the people want, and that's what the government has to provide for them. And this paragraph is where he says that it really doesn't matter whether we call this socialism or democracy, because they both rest on the same assumption, which is the absolute right of the community to determine its own destiny and that of its members. Men as communities are supreme over men as individuals. Limits of wisdom and convenience to the public control there may be. Limits of principle there are. Upon strict analysis, none. In other words, one of the correlates of this is that there are no natural rights, that there are no rights that anybody has within society versus society as a whole. Society has an absolute right over all of its members to control them in any way that is necessary to achieve the desired results that are desired by society as a whole. And this is what he considers to be the essence of socialism, but also the essence of democracy itself, and therefore what a statesman would be aiming at in achieving his control over people, as he put it in the other essay, would be to enable society to have control over itself. So that's kind of how these two things go together. Society wants control over itself, but it needs a statesman who's actually going to do that, because, as we mentioned before, the people themselves are not going to actually run this thing. So they need somebody like Wilson, for example, to do it for them. And finally, just to tie this back into what we saw with Marx and the section on capitalism, what exactly is the context for all this control and the need to exert all this control? It is fundamentally an economic thing, as we've already seen, organizing the economic realm to the point where everybody has the material goods that they need. But the specifics of this, again, come out of what I was describing as this kind of contest between two different Machiavellian models. In the capitalist model, it's the corporations, the big business enterprises, the capitalists who end up with all the power and control. And Wilson alludes to them here. He says that the corporations grow in every hand, they swallow and overawe individuals. The contest is no longer between government and individuals, it's now between government and dangerous combinations of individuals, these big corporations. It's a monstrous thing, he says. So you notice how he's using the Machiavellian playbook. Machiavelli says that when you want to take power and you want to act against somebody, you want to eliminate them or neutralize them, you need to make them the enemy. You have to portray them as the enemy of the people. And this is precisely what happens with socialism and progressivism, is that it looks at the titans of industry, the big business, and it makes that the enemy. And this is the justification for giving more political control to those like Wilson, who portray themselves as the defenders of the people, so that they can use that power and control to satisfy the people by rearranging the economic affairs. But as I mentioned before, this leads to perpetual problems, because once you take control of the business away from those who have the profit motive, then there's the danger of actually disrupting the profitability and the success of it. And so if that's too successful, it could actually be self-destructive to the society. Or if it's clear enough early enough that that's happening, then it can lead to political contention and back and forth contestation between those who are supporting that more socialistic mode and those who are opposing it, which tends to be a large part of the political conflict that occurs today in the United States. So this concludes our discussion of Machiavelli and his influence. And next time we're going to start to move in the direction of classical thought, and we're going to begin with a writer who was writing actually in the 19th century, scandalous to Wilson perhaps, and writing from a Socratic point of view. And he's going to be looking at some of the things that we associate with the influence of Machiavelli in modern society, and commenting on those things with an eye towards directing us back towards a kind of Socratic wisdom that might appreciate some of the features of this Machiavellian society, but also might be critical of other features. And we'll use that as kind of a springboard before getting into the study of Socrates himself, and then some of the other thinkers who were influenced by him over the centuries.